How quickly, in truth, could we see new updated vaccines in market?
3 months. I think that the manufacturers would start making them at risk, so you'd have supply ready to go when you get regulatory approval. And FDA is following a model like the one they used for the boosters, where they're going to look at a subset of patients. They're going to expose a subset of patients, a small subset of patients, to the actual vaccine, and then look at what we call immunogenicity data, basically data on the antibody production. Now, I would expect that if, in fact, we do pivot over to a Omicron vaccine, which I think is a big if, I think it's very speculative at this point, it would only be for a subset of the population. You'd want to stick with the old vaccine as long as possible, because what we've seen in the past when we've fashioned vaccines against specific variants is those vaccines might work better against the specific variant, but they seem to work less well against the full complement of variants that circulated in the market previously. So it seems like the vaccine against the ancestral strain has the broadest possible immunity against the widest complement of variants. So what might happen is if we do have an Omicron-specific vaccine, you might first use it in a very high-risk population, maybe older individuals and immunocompromised individuals who need that very specific immunity against the predominant variant. But for everyone else, the old vaccine properly boosted will be good enough. And I do believe that's going to be the case. I think the existing vaccines properly boosted are going to be protective enough for most people that they're going to afford a reasonably high degree of assurance.
Scott, we've been talking all morning about when the drug makers would decide to make the pivot. Is it a full pivot? It sounds to me like you're suggesting it may not be a full pivot. You'd still continue to manufacture the current vaccine and then manufacture some of this new vaccine. And also, and this is really to a question that Becky raised in the past hour, could you capture both in the same vaccine? Meaning, could you have the equivalent of something that goes after Delta and Omicron in the same shot?
Yeah, look, I think the question of whether or not you make a full pivot is going to be determined within, the next couple of months. I think before you really have a sense of how these vaccines are performing in the market, you don't want to do that. And so there's going to be an effort made to manufacture some of these new vaccines, but not make a full pivot until you actually have the clinical data. And remember, there's a lot of the existing vaccine already in the supply chain. So even if you bias the manufacturing over to the new vaccine, there's a time frame in which it takes to produce that vaccine. You want to work off the supply that you have if it's still effective. Again, I just don't. Right. I think there's going to be a reluctance in the scientific community to do that sort of full pivot until you really understand how well these vaccines are working. Right. If you look at what's happening in South Africa right now, the cases are among a younger population that we presume is largely unvaccinated. So it seems to be reinfecting people who previously had Delta. We don't know yet how well it's performing against the vaccines.
Well, the question I was going to ask you, Scott, is this idea of whether we're trying to avoid hospitalization and death, but we're fine with, quote unquote, infection, or we're trying to avoid infection. Right. And you see different countries approaching this in different ways. Israel, for example, appears to have gone at this and said, we don't want anyone to get infected if we can avoid it. And so they've been very, very aggressive. The U.S. has been a lot less aggressive in that regard.
Right. So what happens if we find, and this is just speculation, I'm just throwing this out, what happens if we find that a properly boosted vaccine is 40% protective against infection for Omicron, 60% protective against symptomatic infection, and 90% protective against severe disease? I think a lot of public health officials would say that's a very good vaccine. I think that would probably change the expectations that consumers have about what the vaccines are delivering, because they expect the vaccines to prevent them from being infected. But I would also say that what I just laid out, the 40, 60, 90, is basically the measure of protection that most people who are vaccinated with only 2 doses more than 6 or 7 months ago probably have against Delta right now. So that's actually the measure of protection that's probably being afforded an individual who hasn't been boosted and was vaccinated a long time ago against the Delta variant. So that would still be a very good vaccine if you have that kind of outcome. And there's reason to believe that you could have something like that, where the vaccines will still be protective against symptomatic and severe disease, less protective against any infection at all. Remember, what we're measuring in South Africa right now is infection. We really don't have good data on what the outcomes are. We see hospitalizations ticking up, but that data is very unreliable because they report hospitalizations sometimes 2 weeks late. So you don't know what's really happening. You're going to have to watch a couple of weeks of data to make a determination there.
Shepard Smith here. Thanks for watching CNBC on YouTube.